My mother died while giving birth to my baby sister, then Dad remarried. The nurse responsible for helping Mom in the delivery room. My mom called my little sister because they both died during childbirth. One day she was talking about how excited she was for our family to grow. The next I was crying in the hospital chair beside her lifeless body. The nurse who delivered my sister was this woman named Sandra, whose hand kept lingering on my dad's shoulder, whispering that everything would be okay. I thought it was weird how she already knew his name was Michael and not Mr. Davidson like all the other nurses called him. But I was 17 and had just lost my mom, so I didn't think much about it at the time. Dad married Sandra 6 months later. I remember sitting in my English class when he texted me about proposing to her. All I could think about was how Mom would never get to see me be an English teacher just like her, and now Dad was replacing her like she was nothing. Sandra moved in right away and started redecorating everything. She took down Mom's wind chimes from the front porch because the sound gave her migraines. She replaced Mom's lavender bushes with some ugly modern sculptures. Dad just nodded along whenever she suggested changes like he was sleepwalking through life. The first time Sandra mentioned nursing school was when she was packing up Mom's books for donation. She held up Mom's annotated copy of Jane Eyre and said, "You know, Emma, you'd make such a wonderful nurse. Just like me. It's such a stable career." I just took the book from her hands and went to my room. Dad followed me and grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave marks. "You need to respect your stepmother," he said in this quiet voice that scared me more than yelling. That was when I realized it wasn't just my mom who died that day. The man who I thought was my dad had died too. Things got worse after that. Dad would blow up over nothing, like when I left a water glass on the counter or came home 5 minutes late from school. Sandra would stand behind him during these lectures with this little smile plastered on her face. She started intercepting my mail and monitoring my phone for my own good because I seemed depressed. I threw myself into my writing and English classes. It was the only thing that felt real anymore. Mrs. Peterson helped me enter this statewide writing competition, and I wrote about grief and loss and finding your voice when everyone wants to silence it. When I won regionals, Sandra's face went cold. "Writing doesn't pay the bills," she said over dinner. "Nursing does." The acceptance letters started coming in March. I'd applied to 8 schools with amazing English programs, but somehow never saw a single envelope. Then my neighbor Mrs. Chen knocked on our door holding a stack of mail that had been delivered to her house, by mistake. All my acceptances, including a full ride to my dream school. I confronted them that night and found out Sandra had been deleting my emails from colleges and submitting nursing school applications in my name. Dad broke my laptop when I refused to consider her career choice, slammed it against the wall while screaming about ungrateful daughters. Sandra just sat there filing her nails. That's when I started digging into Mom's death. Something Mrs. Peterson said about Mom being so healthy during her pregnancy kept nagging at me. I requested the medical records and found weird gaps in the timeline and medication doses that didn't make sense. Then I found Dad's old credit card statements in the garage showing hotel charges from 8 months before Mom died, hotels he'd gone to with Sandra. Everything came to a head on my 18th birthday. I'd gathered all my evidence, including a journal Mom had hidden where she wrote about her suspicions about Sandra. I announced at my birthday dinner with all our relatives that I knew about the affair. I showed them the proof while Sandra tried to claim I was having a mental breakdown. But the worst part came when I was packing for college the next week. I needed my birth certificate for some forms and found it in Dad's filing cabinet. Right there under Father was a name I'd never seen before. Marcus Williams, some guy Mom dated before meeting Dad. Suddenly everything made sense. Why Dad had always been cold to me even before Sandra. Why he'd seemed almost relieved when Mom died. I stared at that name for what felt like hours. Marcus Williams. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and started searching. There he was, a local contractor who died in a car accident when I was 2 years old. The obituary mentioned he left behind a daughter, Emma, me. I heard footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved everything back into the filing cabinet. Dad appeared in the doorway, his face red and blotchy. He saw what I was holding and lunged forward, ripping the birth certificate from my hands. The paper tore down the middle. "You had no right," he slurred, bourbon heavy on his breath. Sandra appeared behind him, her nurse scrubs still on from her shift. She took one look at the scene and her eyes narrowed. "What did she find?" she asked, but Dad was already stumbling back downstairs, the torn certificate crumpled in his fist. The next morning, I woke up to find my car keys missing. Sandra stood in the kitchen, filing her nails like always. "Your father thinks you need some time to process everything," she said without looking up. "We've decided you should defer your college enrollment, take a gap year, maybe reconsider nursing school." I walked past her to the garage where I kept my backup set hidden in an old paint can. As I drove away, I saw her watching from the window, her phone pressed to her ear. College couldn't come fast enough. I spent the next week at Jessica's house, my best friend since middle school. Her parents let me sleep on their couch and didn't ask too many questions when I showed up with just a duffel bag. I'd managed to grab my important documents, Mom's journal, and the clothes I'd need for school. 3 days before I was supposed to leave for college, Sandra called Jessica's mom claiming I'd stolen medication from their house. Campus security called next, saying someone had reported concerns about an incoming student with mental health issues who might be a danger to others. The admissions office received an anonymous tip about plagiarism in my application essays. I spent hours on the phone clearing everything up. My English teacher, Mrs. Peterson, vouched for my essay's authenticity. The campus security officer seemed confused about why a concerned stepmother would make such claims without any documentation. Jessica's mom told Sandra to stop calling or she'd involve the police. Move-in day finally arrived. Dad and Sandra didn't come, which was fine by me. I'd arranged everything myself, including switching my emergency contact information to Mrs. Peterson. As I unpacked in my dorm room, my new roommate Alexandra introduced herself. She seemed nice enough, chattering about her hometown and her boyfriend back home. The first few weeks passed in a blur of classes and adjustments. I threw myself into my English course courses, finally free to pursue what I loved. My composition professor, Dr. Chen, no relation to my neighbor, praised my first essay about finding identity through literature. Everything felt like it was finally falling into place. Then Sandra started calling the university. It began small. The registrar's office mentioned someone had called to verify my enrollment status. Financial aid received inquiries about my scholarship eligibility from a woman claiming to be my mother. My academic advisor left a voicemail saying my mom had expressed concerns about my course load. I changed my FERPA settings to restrict all information and explicitly noted that Sandra was not authorized to receive any details about my education, but she kept finding ways around it. One afternoon, Dr. Chen pulled me aside after class. "Emma, someone called claiming to be your mother. She said you've been struggling with delusions about your family situation. I wanted to check if everything was all right." My stomach dropped. I explained the situation as professionally as I could, and Dr. Chen's expression grew increasingly concerned. "Document everything," she advised. "Keep records of all these contacts. You might need them." The calls escalated. Sandra told the health center I'd gone off medication I'd never been prescribed. She reported to Residence Life that I was having episodes and might hurt myself. Each time I had to sit through meetings and evaluations, proving I was fine, showing them I'd never been on any medication, explaining over and over that my stepmother was lying. Then came Thanksgiving break. I'd planned to stay on campus, but Sandra had other ideas. She called claiming there was a family emergency, that Dad had been hospitalized. When I called the hospital directly, they had no record of him being admitted. Campus security later told me someone matching Sandra's description had been asking about guest access to the dorms. I started documenting everything like Dr. Chen suggested. Screenshots of missed calls, emails from various departments about the false reports, security footage requests. My RA helped me file a report with campus police about the harassment. 2 weeks before finals, things took a darker turn. Dad showed up during Dr. Chen's office hours, hammered and belligerent. He stormed into the English department demanding to see me, shouting about ungrateful daughters and the money he'd wasted raising another man's child. Security removed him, but not before he'd made a scene in front of half the faculty. Dr. Chen sat with me afterward as I filled out paperwork for a no-contact order. "No student should have to deal with this," she said, her hand gentle on my shoulder. "We'll make sure you're safe here." The order was approved within days. Dad and Sandra were banned from campus and prohibited from contacting me through any means. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Sandra got creative. She started using different phone numbers, calling from her work, having colleagues relay messages. Dad sent letters to my professors claiming I owed him money for my upbringing. When those were returned, he threatened to cancel my car insurance and phone plan if I didn't come home for winter break. I picked up extra shifts at the campus bookstore. When that wasn't enough, I got a second job at the library, working late nights to cover my expenses. It was exhausting, but it was worth it for the independence. One evening, Alexandra mentioned something odd. "Hey, someone called while you were in class. They said they were from financial aid and needed to verify some information, but the questions were weird. They wanted to know about your family medical history and if you had any diagnosed mental conditions." My blood ran cold. I immediately went to the financial aid office, where they confirmed no one had called from their department. We traced the number. It belonged to the hospital where Sandra worked. That's when I started digging deeper into Mom's things. In her journal, I found a reference to her cousin Beth, who lived 2 states away. Mom had written about wanting Emma to know her extended family someday. I found Beth on social media and reached out. Beth's response changed everything. She'd been trying to contact me for years, but Dad had always intercepted her attempts. She mentioned something about an inheritance from my maternal grandmother, money set aside specifically for my education, about $15,000 that Dad had never mentioned. I met with a legal aid attorney on campus who helped me file the paperwork to access the inheritance. That's when we discovered Dad had been trying to claim it as childcare reimbursement since he'd raised me knowing I wasn't his biological daughter. The winter break deadline loomed. Dad's threats became more desperate. He'd already canceled my phone plan, so I got a cheap prepaid one. When he canceled my car insurance, I sold the car and used the money for a bus pass and groceries. Each step toward independence felt like a small victory. Then came the night that changed everything. I was working late at the library when security called. Someone had reported a break-in attempt at my dorm room. When I got back, my door was ajar and several items were missing. Nothing valuable, just some of Mom's things I'd kept. Sandra's perfume lingered in the air. Security reviewed the footage. Someone had convinced a new desk attendant they were my mother picking up forgotten items. The attendant, not knowing the situation, had let them in. We filed a police report, but without concrete proof it was Sandra, there wasn't much they could do. The campus police officer handed me a copy of the incident report while I sat in their small office, still processing what had happened. My hands trembled as I read through the details. The desk attendant described a woman in her 40s with blonde hair and nurse scrubs, who'd shown a hospital ID and claimed I'd asked her to retrieve some family photos for a school project. I spent the rest of that night in the library, too unsettled to return to my room. Alexandra texted asking if I was okay, mentioning she'd noticed some of her own things had been moved around. The violation of my space made my skin crawl. Those missing items weren't random. Sandra had taken specific things that belonged to Mom, including a small jewelry box with her wedding ring from Marcus Williams. The next morning brought a new crisis. My academic advisor called me in for an urgent meeting. Someone had submitted a formal complaint to the dean's office claiming I was mentally unstable and shouldn't be allowed to continue my studies. The complaint included fabricated medical records from Sandra's hospital, complete with forged signatures from doctors who didn't exist. Dr. Chen accompanied me to the meeting with the dean. She'd compiled a folder documenting my excellent academic performance and the pattern of harassment I'd been experiencing. The dean, a stern woman named Dr. Martinez, listened carefully as we explained the situation. She assured me the complaint would be dismissed, but advised me to consider additional security measures. I changed dorm rooms that week, moving to a different building with stricter access controls. Alexandra helped me pack, clearly relieved to be away from the drama. My new roommate, a quiet pre-med student named Tori, barely looked up from her textbooks when I moved in. The anonymity was exactly what I needed. Beth called me that evening with updates about the inheritance. She'd found documentation showing my grandmother had specifically designated the money for my education, with clear instructions that it should go directly to me at 18. Dad's attempts to claim it were being rejected, but he'd hired a lawyer to contest the will. I started spending more time in the legal aid office, learning about my rights and options. The attorney, a young woman named Ms. Rodriguez, helped me understand the complexities of inheritance law. She also suggested I look into Marcus Williams's family, as there might be additional resources or support available. The research into my biological father's background revealed surprising connections. Marcus had owned a successful contracting business, and his brother still ran it. When I reached out tentatively, Uncle James, as he insisted I call him, was overjoyed to hear from me. He'd been searching for me since Marcus died, but had been stonewalled by Dad at every turn. James drove down to campus the following weekend. Meeting him felt surreal. He had the same green eyes I saw in the mirror every morning. Over coffee, he shared stories about Marcus and showed me photos I'd never seen. He also mentioned that Marcus had life insurance that should have gone to me, but Dad had never filed the claim. While I was building these new connections, Sandra's harassment evolved. She started contacting my professors directly, sending emails from various accounts claiming I was submitting plagiarized work. Dr. Chen and my other instructors recognized the pattern, but it meant constant vigilance and documentation on my part. The campus bookstore manager pulled me aside one afternoon. Someone had called claiming to be conducting a background check for a nursing school application I'd supposedly submitted. They'd asked detailed questions about my work performance and any signs of mental instability. My manager, thankfully, had refused to provide any information and reported the call to campus security. Finals week arrived with its own challenges. I'd been studying in the library when I noticed a familiar figure outside. Dad sat in his car in the parking lot, just watching the building. He couldn't enter campus, but he could park on the public street. I called campus security, who escorted me back to my dorm and increased patrols in the area. My grades that semester reflected my determination, straight A's despite everything. Dr. Chen nominated me for an undergraduate research position that would provide additional funding and academic support. The interview committee was impressed by my essay on using literature as a tool for processing trauma. Winter break meant finding somewhere else to stay. Beth immediately offered her guest room, but I worried about bringing my problems to her doorstep. Instead, I arranged to stay on campus through a program for international students who couldn't go home. The dorms were nearly empty, but the peace was worth it. That's when I discovered Sandra had been busier than I'd realized. A large envelope arrived at the campus mail center, forwarded from multiple addresses. Inside were copies of letters Sandra had sent to various nursing schools in my name, withdrawing applications I'd never submitted. Each letter included personal details only someone with access to my records could know. I spent Christmas Day in the empty dorm lounge, video chatting with Beth and her family. They'd set a place for me at their table, propping a laptop where I would have sat. It was bittersweet, the warmth of newfound family mixed with the ache of everything I'd lost. The new semester brought fresh challenges. I returned to find my campus mailbox stuffed with letters from collection agencies. Apparently, Sandra had opened credit cards in my name and run up thousands in debt. The bills were for medical supplies and nursing textbooks, a twisted attempt to force her career choice on me even from a distance. Ms. Rodriguez helped me file fraud reports and begin the process of clearing my credit. Each agency required extensive documentation, police reports, and sworn affidavits. I spent hours on the phone, explaining the same story repeatedly, faxing copies of my ID and proof of enrollment. Uncle James offered to help with legal fees, but I was determined to handle it myself. The inheritance from my grandmother was tied up in legal challenges, but I'd learned about a special scholarship fund for students facing unusual hardships. My application detailed the harassment and identity theft, supported by letters from Dr. Chen and campus security. One morning, I woke to find my new dorm room door had been tampered with. The lock showed signs of attempted entry, with scratches around the keyhole. Security reviewed footage showing a woman in a baseball cap and sunglasses trying different keys before being scared off by a passing student. We all knew who it was, but the disguise made it hard to prove. I started varying my routines, taking different routes to class and studying in random locations. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but necessary. My grades began to slip as the stress accumulated. Dr. Chen noticed and arranged for me to receive counseling through student services. The therapist, Dr. Patel, helped me process not just the current harassment, but years of manipulation and abuse. We talked about Mom's death, the signs I'd missed, the way Dad and Sandra had systematically isolated me. For the first time, I began to understand that none of this was my fault. Sandra's next move caught everyone off guard. She showed up at Uncle James's business, claiming to be conducting a welfare check on behalf of the family. She told his employees that I was mentally ill and had been making false accusations against my loving parents. James had to threaten legal action to get her to leave. The restraining order I'd filed months earlier seemed worthless. Sandra always found ways to skirt the edges of it, technically not violating the terms while still making her presence felt. The police said without proof of direct contact, their hands were tied. Then came the letters to my high school. Sandra contacted Mrs. Peterson and other teachers who'd supported me, warning them about my dangerous delusions and suggesting they distance themselves for their own safety. Mrs. Peterson forwarded the emails to me, along with her response telling Sandra to cease all contact or face harassment charges. I decided to be proactive. With Ms. Rodriguez's help, I compiled a comprehensive file documenting every incident, every false report, every attempted interference with my education application. We sent copies to relevant authorities and created a paper trail that would be hard to ignore. The scholarship committee approved my application, providing enough funding to cover my expenses without needing to work multiple jobs. The relief was overwhelming. I could focus on my studies and the research position Dr. Chen had secured for me. Spring break approached with new anxieties. I'd planned to visit Beth and finally meet more of Mom's family, but I worried about Sandra following me. Beth assured me they had security cameras and her husband was a retired police officer who knew how to handle situations like mine. The visit was everything I'd hoped for. Beth's photo albums revealed a whole history I'd never known. Mom had been close to her extended family before meeting Dad, but he'd gradually cut those ties. There were pictures of Mom holding baby me, looking genuinely happy in a way I'd never seen in Dad's photos. Beth's daughter, my cousin Lily, was studying to become a social worker. She recognized the patterns of abuse in my story and helped me understand the psychological tactics Sandra and Dad had used. We spent hours talking about generational trauma and breaking cycles. While I was away, Sandra made her boldest move yet. She somehow convinced a new employee at the registrar's office that she was picking up transcripts for her daughter's transfer application. By the time the error was discovered, she had copies of all my grades and course information. The university took this breach seriously. They implemented new security protocols and required additional verification for all records requests. Sandra's photo was distributed to all administrative offices with clear instructions that she was not authorized to access any student information. I returned from spring break to find Dad had escalated his financial threats. He'd filed a lawsuit claiming I owed him 18 years of child support since he'd raised me under false pretenses. The lawsuit was frivolous, but I still had to respond or risk a default judgment. Uncle James connected me with a family law attorney who took the case pro bono. She explained that Dad had no legal standing, but the nuisance suits were a common harassment tactic. We counterfiled for my legal fees and damages from the intentional infliction of emotional distress. The stress began affecting my physical health. I developed migraines and stomach issues that made it hard to concentrate. The campus health center prescribed medication and recommended stress management techniques, but it was hard to relax when I never knew what Sandra would do next. My research position with Dr. Chen became a sanctuary. We were analyzing themes of maternal loss in contemporary literature, work that felt deeply personal. Dr. Chen knew about my situation and often let me work from her office when I felt unsafe in public spaces. One afternoon, while organizing files in the English department, I overheard two professors discussing a strange phone call. Someone claiming to be from a background check company had called about a student named Emma, asking if she'd ever displayed violent tendencies. My blood ran cold as I realized Sandra was now trying to sabotage future job prospects. Dr. Chen helped me draft a letter to send to potential employers and graduate schools, explaining the situation professionally and providing contact information for references who could verify the harassment. It felt humiliating to have to disclose such personal information, but it was better than letting Sandra's lies go unchallenged. The inheritance case finally moved forward. The judge reviewed the documentation and ruled in my favor, ordering the funds to be released immediately. Dad's lawyer tried to argue for a delay, but the judge saw through the stalling tactics and threatened sanctions if they continued frivolous motions. I received the check on a Tuesday afternoon, $15,000, not a fortune, but enough to provide real security. I immediately opened a new bank account at a different institution than the one Dad used, taking every precaution to keep the information private. Sandra's response was swift. She filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services, claiming I was being financially exploited by Beth and Uncle James. The social worker who investigated quickly realized the complaint was baseless, but I still had to sit through interviews and provide documentation of my mental competency. The pattern was exhausting. Every step forward triggered new attacks from Sandra and Dad, but something had shifted in me. Instead of feeling defeated, I began to see their desperation. They were running out of tactics, recycling the same false accusations that authorities were beginning to recognize as harassment. I threw myself into planning for the future. With my inheritance secure and the scholarship funding my education, I could think beyond mere survival. I researched graduate programs, looking for schools far enough away to make Sandra's interference more difficult. Dr. Chen encouraged me to submit my research on maternal loss to undergraduate journals. The work was personal but academically rigorous, examining how contemporary authors used narrative structure to process grief. When the first acceptance letter came, I cried in her office, tears of validation rather than sadness. Summer session began with new challenges. I'd decided to take additional courses to accelerate my graduation timeline. The sooner I finished my degree, the sooner I could put physical distance between myself and my tormentors. But Sandra had anticipated this move. She began showing up at businesses near campus where she knew I shopped or studied. Always careful to stay just outside the restraining order's boundaries, she would sit in her car watching, making sure I saw her. The psychological warfare was taking its toll. Campus security increased their patrols and gave me a direct number to call. They couldn't arrest her for sitting in public spaces, but they could document the pattern of stalking behavior. Each report added to the file Mrs. Rodriguez was building for a more comprehensive legal response. One evening, while working late in the computer lab, I noticed someone had been using my student account to print documents. The IT department traced the access to a computer in the public library downtown. The documents printed were applications to nursing schools, all filled out with my information but Sandra's contact details. We reported it to both campus police and the city authorities. The library had security footage showing Sandra using the computer with a stolen password she'd somehow obtained. This was the concrete evidence we'd been waiting for, clear proof of identity theft and unauthorized computer access. The arrest warrant was issued within days. Sandra was taken into custody at the hospital where she worked, let out in handcuffs in front of her colleagues. The charges included identity identity theft, computer fraud, and violation of the restraining order. Finally, there would be real consequences. Dad's reaction was predictable. He called the university president's office, ranting about the conspiracy against his family. He threatened lawsuits against the school, against me, against anyone who'd helped me. The president's assistant calmly informed him that all future communication must go through the university's legal counsel. With Sandra in jail awaiting trial, I experienced something I'd almost forgotten: peace. For the first time in over a year, I could walk to class without constantly checking over my shoulder. I could answer my phone without dreading what I might hear. The relief was overwhelming, but I knew this was just a respite. Sandra would likely make bail, and Dad's rage would only intensify. I used this time to strengthen my support systems and plan for the challenges ahead. The summer session was intensive, but I thrived in the focused academic environment. My research with Dr. Chen evolved into a larger project, examining how women writers throughout history had used literature to document abuse and find their voices. The work felt like a continuation of Mom's legacy as an English teacher, a way to honor her memory while building my own path. As the summer drew to a close, I received news that would change everything. Uncle James had been investigating Marcus Williams's death more thoroughly. The accident that culled my biological father was starting to look suspicious, especially given the timing. Just months after Mom had told him about her pregnancy, Uncle James had hired a private investigator to look into the crash that culled Marcus. The investigator found inconsistencies in the police report, skid marks that didn't match the supposed trajectory, witness statements that contradicted the official narrative. Most disturbing was a mechanic's report showing Marcus had just had his brakes serviced the week before the accident. I met with the investigator in a coffee shop near campus. He spread out documents across the table, pointing to highlighted sections. The timing was too convenient. Marcus had filed for custody rights just 2 weeks before his death. He'd been building a case to get visitation with me. Sandra made bail 3 days later. The conditions prohibited her from contacting me directly, but she found other ways. Flowers started appearing at my dorm. No card, but the arrangement always included white lilies, Mom's least favorite flower. Sandra knew Mom had been allergic to them. I changed my class schedule, but somehow Sandra always knew where I'd be. I'd spot her car in parking lots, see her silhouette in store windows. The campus police documented each sighting, but she was careful never to violate the technical terms of her bail. Dr. Chen suggested I apply for a teaching assistantship at her colleague's university 3 states away. The position would start immediately after graduation, providing both income and distance. I submitted my application that night, using Dr. Chen's office address to keep the location private. Dad's drinking had gotten worse. Uncle James heard through mutual acquaintances that Dad had been fired from his job after showing up intoxicated multiple times. He'd burned through their savings trying to fight the inheritance ruling and pay for Sandra's legal defense. The credit card companies finally cleared the fraudulent charges, but my credit score was destroyed. Ms. Rodriguez helped me file a complaint with the Consumer Protection Bureau, documenting how the identity theft had impacted my ability to secure housing for after graduation. 2 weeks before finals, I noticed someone following me between classes. Not Sandra this time, a young man I didn't recognize. He kept his distance but appeared wherever I went. Campus security confronted him and discovered he was a process server Sandra had hired to deliver papers for a civil suit. She was suing me for defamation, claiming my false accusations had cost her her nursing career. The lawsuit was as frivolous as Dad's had been, but it meant more legal fees, more time in court, more energy drained fighting their endless attacks. Beth drove down for my graduation ceremony. She brought photos of Mom from college, showing her in cap and gown with the same English department honor cords I'd be wearing. Uncle James came too, proud as any father would be. Mrs. Peterson sat with them, wiping tears during the ceremony. I'd kept my post-graduation plans secret from everyone except my closest supporters. The teaching position had come through, and I'd already shipped my belongings to a storage unit near the new university. My flight was booked for the day after graduation. Sandra appeared at the edge of the ceremony, standing just outside the venue's property line. She held a sign that said, "Fraud," in large letters. Campus security couldn't remove her from the public sidewalk, but they formed a barrier to block her from other attendees' view. That night, Beth helped me pack my remaining belongings. We found a note slipped under my door, Sandra's handwriting, warning that she'd find me wherever I went. I added it to the evidence file, now thick enough to fill a banker's box. The next morning, I discovered my flight had been canceled. Someone had called the airline claiming to be me, saying I'd had a mental health emergency. It took hours to sort out, and I missed my connection. I had to book a new flight under Beth's name to avoid further interference. At the airport, I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see Sandra or Dad appear, but the security checkpoint passed without incident, and soon I was boarding the plane to my new life. Beth hugged me tight at the gate, promising to visit once I was settled. The new university town was smaller, quieter. I'd rented a studio apartment under a month-to-month lease, paranoid about committing to anything Sandra could track. The teaching assistantship coordinator, Dr. Ramirez, welcomed me warmly, but noticed my nervousness about paperwork. I threw myself into preparation for the classes I'd be assisting with. The work felt healing, helping other students find their voices through writing, the way Mrs. Peterson had helped me. My office was tiny, but it felt like a sanctuary. 3 weeks into the semester, I got a call from Mrs. Rodriguez. Sandra's trial date had been set. She'd been offered a plea deal, 2 years probation and mandatory counseling in exchange for pleading guilty to identity theft. It wasn't enough, but it was something. Dad had started calling the English department, but the secretary had been briefed on the situation. She documented each call and forwarded them to campus security. The new university took the threat seriously, implementing security measures from day one. I started seeing a therapist at the University Counseling Center. Dr. Kim specialized in trauma from family abuse. She helped me understand that my hypervigilance was a normal response to sustained harassment. We worked on strategies for feeling safe safe while not letting fear control my life. Sandra took the plea deal. The judge ordered her to pay restitution for the credit card fraud and banned her from any contact with me, including third-party contact. Violating the order would mean immediate jail time. Dad wasn't covered by the order, but his calls had stopped after Sandra's conviction. Uncle James sent updates about the investigation into Marcus's death. The case was being reviewed by the cold case unit, but without new evidence, it was unlikely to go anywhere. Still, knowing the truth helped me understand Mom's choices better. I excelled in my teaching role. My students responded to my passion for literature, and Dr. Ramirez recommended me for additional sections. The income was modest, but enough to cover my expenses and start rebuilding my credit. 6 months into my new life, I got a letter forwarded from my old university. Sandra had written from a psychiatric facility where she was receiving court-ordered treatment. The letter was full of accusations and threats. I immediately reported it to her probation officer. Sandra was arrested for violating her probation. This time, she was sentenced to 18 months in jail. Dad, now alone and drinking heavily, lost the house to foreclosure. Uncle James heard he'd moved in with distant relatives who barely tolerated him. I continued my graduate studies while teaching, working on my thesis about trauma narratives in contemporary women's literature. Dr. Chen stayed in touch, offering guidance and celebrating my small victories. She nominated me for a conference presentation on my research. The conference was my first professional presentation. I spoke about how writers like Toni Morrison and Louise Erdrich used fragmented narrative structures to mirror the experience of processing trauma. The audience was small but engaged, and I felt Mom's presence as I spoke. A publisher approached me after the presentation, interested in my thesis. I politely declined their suggestion to write a memoir about my experiences. Instead, I pitched an academic book about teaching writing to trauma survivors. They seemed less interested without the sensational personal story. I completed my master's degree in 3 years while continuing to teach. The graduation ceremony was smaller than my undergraduate one, but Beth, Uncle James, and Mrs. Peterson all made the trip. This time, there were no protesters, no threats, no fear. Dr. Ramirez offered me a full-time instructor position. The salary was modest but stable, with health insurance and retirement benefits. I accepted immediately, finally able to sign a year-long lease on a small house near campus. I learned through Beth that Sandra had been released from jail, but immediately violated parole by trying to contact my old university. She was sent back to serve her full sentence. Dad had been arrested for hammered driving and lost his license permanently after refusing a breathalyzer test. My life settled into a routine I'd never thought possible. Teaching 4 classes per semester, advising the creative writing club, grading papers at my kitchen table with a cup of tea. I adopted a cat from the shelter, naming her Austin after Mom's favorite author. The nightmares faded gradually. I stopped checking locks multiple times and jumping at unexpected knocks. The hypervigilance remained but became manageable. I even started dating a fellow instructor who understood why I was cautious about sharing personal information. On the 5th anniversary of Mom's death, I visited her grave for the first time since leaving. Beth came with me. We left flowers, purple irises, Mom's actual favorite. I told her about my teaching, my students, the life I'd built. It felt like closing a circle. I volunteered at the local women's shelter, teaching resume writing and job interview skills. Many of the women had escaped situations far worse than mine. We never shared our stories directly, but there was an understanding in the way we held space for each other. My 3rd book of academic essays was published by a small university press. It examined how marginalized writers used education as a form of resistance. The dedication read simply, "For my mother, who taught me to find my voice." The book sold modestly to other academics and libraries. Sandra served her full sentence and was released under strict supervision. She was prohibited from practicing nursing and had to register her address with authorities. Last I heard, she was working at a grocery store 2 states away. Her nursing license permanently revoked. Dad died of liver failure 3 years later. Uncle James called to tell me, offering to handle any arrangements. I declined to attend the funeral but contributed to the costs. It felt like the final release from a chapter I'd already closed.